Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from an episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, quote-unquote, Peace President of, quote-unquote, most transparent administration ever threatens treason over war reporting, posted by Jedi Porcupine, and that's a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump, who truthed, the U.S. has massive amounts of, quote-unquote, munitions, especially of certain types. Additionally, large amounts are being manufactured and shipped to the U.S. as needed. Defense companies are building the largest number of plants and factories in our country's history. The quote-unquote leakers of these treasonous statements are being hunted down. Long-term jail sentences will be sought, President DJT. And yeah, personally, I think if Trump wants to say that, he should be able to, but I definitely don't think it's very libertarian to just go after people for freedom of speech, but ultimately, if he wants to go after people for whatever reason he wants to go after them for, he has the ability to justify doing it, since the executive branch is the one in charge of enforcing the laws. And yeah, personally, I think it's all just really political theater. I think for the president, it's mostly just a figurehead. Donald Trump pretty much has always been a WWE-style distraction for the past 10 or so years, however long he's been politically relevant. Well, over a decade at this point. I think it's 11 years now since he first announced he's running for the 2016 election. But yeah, personally, I think it's all just a distraction. The real power lies in the shadows. The deep state, military-industrial complex, satanic cabal of lizard people, whatever you want to call them. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Senate committee votes to hold Fauci in contempt for refusing to answer COVID questions, posted by Ragnar OKXD, and that's linked to Ground News. It's a bunch of sources reporting on that. And yeah, personally, I think, Fauci should be held accountable for how he manipulated the media during COVID. But, ultimately, I guess you could argue that falls under freedom of speech as well. Personally, I don't think he's going to be ever held accountable. I guess this is probably the most accountable he's going to be held for. I think he should be held in contempt of Congress, because he should be open about his, how he was manipulating the media and using it to destroy his adversaries. But ultimately, I think this is probably the most accountable he's going to be held. Personally, I think it's more accountable than I thought he was ever going to be held. But, it's not really being held accountable. It's all just political theater, Dr. Fauci is just another member of the deep state that will get away. The deep state always wins in the end. That's what you really learn when it comes to following American politics. Next, we have the Obama wing of the Democratic Party is declaring war on progressives. Why don't they ever bring this energy against Trump? Why do they hate working class people even more? Posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross-post from the Work Reform subreddit, and that's a headline from the New York Times. Moderate Democrats prepare for quote-unquote war against an ascendant left. One moderate group says the progressive winds are quote-unquote deeply troubling and is planning a $15 million effort against democratic socialism. And yeah, personally, it's just going to be two different ways of screwing you over. The moderate Democrats are currently in charge of the party, screwed us over for decades, and now the Democratic Socialists taking in charge of the party are going to continue screwing us over. It's all just theater. They'll all probably get along behind the scenes. The uniparty, it doesn't really matter who's in control of them. Look at Donald Trump. He was supposed to be this great outsider who was going to free us from, the deep state. But in reality, the deep state's only expanded ever since he entered the political arena. And it just goes to show you that, the two major parties, I think, are inherently beyond salvation at this point. If I were the Democratic Socialists, I'd form my own socialist party and go from there. But, I know that might be kind of hard to do when the two major parties are so ingrained into the American culture after almost 2 centuries of being the major parties. And so but ultimately I do think it's time to move on from them, even if it's not quite the most realistic proposition to do so. Next we have DSA's hostile takeover of the Democratic Party, posted by Socialist or Morons, and that's a YouTube video from Reason TV. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for DSA's hostile takeover of the Democratic Party, but it's really just they're just gonna screw us over like the old people in charge of the Democratic Party. Just because they change their branding and message doesn't mean they're gonna change anything else. In reality, I think politics is really people are always saying there's going to be massive change, but massive change really never comes, because it's inherently going to be the people in positions of power using the state to enforce their will on everyone else, and that's true regardless of which person is leading the state, be they a communist, a fascist, a socialist, a moderate, etc., etc. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump's newest tariffs protect America from the national security risk of brass instruments, posted by Johnny Porcupine, and that's an article from Reason.com. And yeah, personally, I think, if the state wants to impose a tariff on brass instruments, it has every ability to do so. But I personally think, if you shouldn't have to pay any tariffs or taxes if you don't feel like it. And if you want to get your brass instruments from overseas, I personally prefer manufacturing to be located more at home rather than abroad. But ultimately, if people can do it for cheaper overseas, they're going to justify that. So ultimately, get your brass instruments from wherever you want to get them. I don't think you should have to pay an extra tax on them just because they're coming from overseas. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have This Is the Way, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a screenshot of it looks like a tweet from Matt Vensel under headline: Police in Winona, Minnesota are stunned for every single one of their flock cameras were suddenly removed in a single night. And the Matt Vensel said, police are asking for the public's help to identify this individual, but the public has been leaving comments like, the flock cameras tore themselves down. Whoever did it was fishing with me. Whoever it was at Bible study with me. And yeah, personally, I would agree with all those alibis. I don't really care for all the flock cameras. I personally I don't really go out looking for them. But if you want to justify taking him down, I think you should be able to justify taking him down. I personally wouldn't, because I don't like getting in trouble with the law. That's only going to get an excuse to get involved in more headaches. But, if you want to justify doing it, that's fine. I personally think the libertarian position is to be against the government surveillance state, and most flock cameras are being used by the government rather than private individuals. Next, we have the GOP is warning about socialism while quietly embracing it, and that's a story from Reason.com, posted by Johnny Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for socialism, but in reality, I would say both major parties are increasingly socialist, and there's really nothing you can do about it. At least the Democrats are becoming more openly socialist. The GOP is just trying to lie that it's not becoming more socialist, when in reality, they're becoming just as, if not more, socialist than the Democrats. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have John Anthony Castro continues fight for freedom, appeals to the Supreme Court and international bodies, posted by Lust1712, and that's crosspost from the neoliberal post subreddit. John Anthony Castro continues fight for freedom, appeals to the Supreme Court and international bodies. And yeah, personally, I think I don't really know too much about John Anthony Castro. I know he did run for the Republican nomination in 2024 against Trump. And it says, looks like the story is from the neoliberal.com. Former Republican presidential candidate says he's a political prisoner. His legal battle enters new phase. And yeah, personally, if I don't know why he's in prison, but if ultimately the state can throw people in prison for whatever reason they feel like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, prisons might be necessary for some extremely violent offenders, but, ultimately, I definitely do think the state is over-reliant on prisons, especially when it comes to non-violent offenders, and those who do victimless crimes, like, drugs and all that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Fetterman says he'd win a Democratic primary today. What the polls say, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Politics subreddit, and that's an article from USA Today. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Fetterman. I do like how he triggers Reddit despite still having a D next to his name, voting and left the party like 90% of the time. But, ultimately, he's just another swamp creature, Israel shill. I voted for him back in 2016 in the Democratic Senate primary, back when he had Bernie's endorsement, because I was more of a blue-pilled socialist back then. But now, he's a good example of, how some people might say one thing on the campaign trail and then get into office and do the exact opposite. And, it's just all most politics is all theater. They're all bought and paid for, and it doesn't really matter who you elect. It's all just political theater first and foremost. The true power in Washington, I would say, isn't elected. It's very much in the bureaucrats and deep state actors that you don't see who really have the power, I would say. Next, we have Trump defies Supreme Court ruling and signs new orders restricting birthright citizenship, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's crosspost from the Politics subreddit, and that's an article from the independent.co.uk. And yeah, personally, if Trump wants to justify doing that, he has every ability to do so. The executive branch enforces the laws, so if he wants to just ignore the Supreme Court who interprets the laws and the Congress who makes the laws, he has every ability to do so. Ultimately, it just goes to show you that, I guess, you could impeach him if he oversteps too much, but his party wouldn't do that. And it would be the same for the Democrats. If he had a D next to his name, they wouldn't impeach him then. And it just goes to show you, the presidency is inherently something that, people are going to defer to in matters of law a lot of the time. So, ultimately, or Michael Mouse, I think, had a good tweet about it. It's like, power is ultimately whatever those in positions of whoever's in charge says it is, and Trump knows that very well. He knows that he can get away with pretty much anything, and ultimately, he's going to justify doing that. Next, we have The Political Compass, Biden and Trump Administration Compared, posted by Third Culture Kid, and that's an article from politicalcompass.org. And yeah, personally, I don't think it really matters what figurehead is in the presidency. It's all just political theater. I would say it's all just a distraction from the fact that a lot of the power isn't with the president, as I said earlier, but with the deep state military industrial complex, satanic cabal, lizard people, whatever you want to call them. Next, we have CMV, change my view. If the Pentagon can't do an audit without failing, then I shouldn't have to pay my taxes. Posted by Aggravating Hall 399, and they added, it makes no sense. We are its taxpayers pay give Pentagon and the Department of Defense $1 trillion a year for budget, but they can't complete an audit. If they can't complete an audit, why should the average American pay taxes to them? Personally, as I see it, the power is in the people. If everyone in America stopped paying taxes, politicians would actually listen to us. Plus, the DoD is wasting taxpayer money, which could be spent on other stuff like national parks and wildlife. And I would agree with that. Ultimately, I think the big issue here is that you're forced to pay taxes at all. Ideally, taxation should be voluntary, and if it is forced, you should be at the very least be able to earmark where your taxpayer dollars go to. If you want your taxpayer dollars to go to the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, I think you should be able to. But a lot of people are forced to pay their taxpayer dollars, and a lot of that money does go to the Pentagon, Department of Defense, and they keep failing audits, even though they get nearly infinite money from the U.S. government. And it just goes to show you that it's very much a pirates and emperor situation. If I failed infinite audits, I'd be in prison. But the Pentagon and the military constantly fails audits, and they just keep on keeping on. It just goes to show you, the state's never going to hold itself accountable for its own failures a lot of the time. And sometimes you just have to cope with that. Next, we have Republican voters in Michigan were so confused they blindly picked the whitest name on the ballot, a random who was no longer even running, while ignoring the actual Trump-endorsed candidate, Amir Hassan, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Mayor McCheese subreddit. And that looks like CNN going over Michigan's 8th district, where some guy who dropped out months ago defeated the Trump-endorsed candidate because, I guess, the people didn't like his name. And I just go to show you, when it comes to voting, people really only care about what letter next to their name is first and foremost, but rather what their name is in the first place. If someone's going to have an ethnic name, people might not want to vote for it. And it just goes to show you, that's a great argument against democracy. People are inherently going to be irrational and just vote for whatever name looks the best a lot of the time. And it doesn't even matter if the other guys, if there's many opponents dropped out or even deceased. It just goes to show you that people, voting is going to be inherently something that is done by irrational actors, but people are inherently irrational, I would say. So that's why I think we should get rid of democracy in the first place, because it's inherently forced collectivism, and just because a tyrant is democratically elected doesn't mean they're not a tyrant, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have a viral tweet set off a discourse on $20 burritos. Here's the truth about inflation, from Reason.com, posted by Shadow Porcupine. And yeah, personally, It just goes to show you that, I think it was Joel Berry of the Babylon Bee who tweeted that, and it's Andrew Colvett. One of our TPUSA college students gave us a take on affordability. Burritos shouldn't cost $20. Yeah, a lot of the sandwich from COVID and Biden era inflation, but they lived experience just the same. It feels like basic things cost too much. And yeah, personally, if you want to justify saying, oh, it's just a $20 burrito, that's fine. But I think I've been retweeting a lot of tweets recently about that discourse. And yeah, it goes to show you how, a lot of Republicans who said, oh, inflation is the worst thing ever under Biden, suddenly are justifying this $20 burrito discourse. I liked Seamus Coughlin and Freedom Tunes had a good tweet about that. Let me see if I can find it. Twitter Republicans in 2036. You think you're entitled to ramen every night? What, when you won't even eat your bug rations? No wonder you still live in a pod. And, as Michael Mallett says, conservatism is often progressivism driving the speed limit, and the progressives will say, oh, you're poor? Well, you better work harder. That's what they said under Biden, at least when it comes to inflation. Oh, inflation, you should be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Now the Republicans who replaced them are now saying pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Just goes to show you that, it's all just theater, The people in power don't care about anything other than their own power. They don't care about the common man. The Democrats can call out this now, but when the second they take power back, they'll be the same thing. They'll say, oh, you enjoy the bug rations we've given you, we peasant. Just because, and it just goes to show you, it's going to be inherently those in positions of power are going to be dismissive to those not in positions of power, and that's why I think it's a good idea to not take them seriously. Just because they have a fancy title and the authority of the state on their side doesn't mean that you have to justify doing whatever they say. Ultimately it's all just theater first and foremost. If people stop believing in the existence of the state and the government, it would collapse overnight. It's all just sociologically imagined, just because they have these fancy titles and fancy government positions doesn't make them any more legitimate than anyone else, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have ICE will release body camera video only when seen in the agency's best interest, policy says. And that was by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit, and that's an article from AP News. And yeah, personally, I think if they want to release a body camera video for whatever reason they feel like they should be able to, ultimately, I think body cam is a good thing. I think that it's a good way for the state to hold itself accountable. With that being said, a lot of progressives who were pushing for body cams back in 2020 are now kind of against them because they keep showing inconvenient truths. Like, I remember I saw one Reddit Live tweet a while ago. It was a Guardian headline. Oh, cops shoot and kill, boy just hardened gardening tool. And then it was the actual picture, which the body camera footage was showing. It was going to attack the police officer with a big garden hoe. And it just goes to show you how the media is inherently going to use language to manipulate rather than communicate. And body cameras are a good way of getting around that. If people are allowed to see the footage for themselves, they'll be allowed to see if the police were justified or not. And regardless of what the current narrative is. And yeah, that's why I personally do think every federal officer or state officer or local officer should be required to wear a body camera so they can be held as accountable as possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Experience Beats Exams, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the SIPS-T subreddit. And that looks like a headline: New Mexico is creating an optional alternative to the bar exam. Law school graduates can become licensed by completing 675 hours of supervised legal work within a year in place of taking the bar exam. And then it shows it's a tweet from Truth and Conciliator. You just created a million Saul Goodmans after the attorney from, I think, Breaking Bad. And yeah, I personally think the Libertarian position is, if they want to have the bar exam to licensed lawyers, they should be able to. If they want to have this other way licensed lawyers, they should be able to. I think the Libertarian position is we shouldn't have any licensing at all. If people want to declare themselves a lawyer, even with no formal training, I think they should be able to. It's all inherently subjective in the end. I personally would prefer a doctor who had a doctor license rather than one who didn't. But ultimately, it's all just really subjective rather than objective. Even the most experienced doctor can make mistakes, and I think that's important to remember. So I think the Libertarian position is, we shouldn't have any state licenses in the first place. Why should you have to ask the government's permission for anything, whether it be becoming a lawyer, becoming a doctor, etc., etc. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have report, White House drafting executive order linking vaccines and autism. From parentheses, dear leader is the source of all truth. Posted by Woke Boogeyman. That's cross-post from the Politics subreddit. It's an article from ArsTechnica.com. And yeah, personally, I think a lot of the vaccines and autism stuff, I think it's kind of a grift. But, ultimately, if they want to justify saying that, they should be able to. Ultimately, it's freedom of speech. If you want to believe vaccines cause autism, you should be able to. If you don't want to believe vaccines cause autism, you should be able to. And if you want to, and justify doing whatever you want as a result of it. If you want to justify not vaccinating your children because you think it will give them autism, you should be able to. If you want to justify vaccinating your kids because you think if you think if you don't think it will give them autism, you should be able to. Think whatever you feel like. It's very much. That it's very much an individual choice when it comes to vaccinating or not vaccinating. Next, we have U.S. Telecom's regulator chief says curbs on Chinese tech imports aim to spur production, counter security risks, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's an article from Reuters. And personally, I think the libertarian position is, if the people want to import tech from China, they should be able to. I personally don't really care for the Chinese government, but Chinese tech can be good. It might be in some ways inferior to the U.S. tech, but maybe in other ways superior. But I don't really know. But ultimately, it's down to individual decision whether people want to import or not that of the state, and that's very much when it comes to any foreign import. True, when it comes to any foreign import, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Congress might give ICE the power to go after shoplifters, posted by Swanpanky Dan, and that's crosspost from the Law subreddit, and that's an article from The Intercept. And yeah, personally, the Congress can give ICE whatever powers it wants to, but ultimately, ICE can really already justify do whatever they feel like. They have any other branch of government law enforcement. They have the monopoly on legal force on their side, and oftentimes they're not going to be held accountable since the state controls the courts and legal system as well. So ultimately, if they want to justify going after shoplifters for any reason, they should be able to. It doesn't matter what Congress says. Next we have, has Trump transformed the presidency? Nope, and the anti-federalists told us why, posted by Third Culture Kid, and that's a YouTube video from Resistance History of Tad Stormer. And personally, I would say in some ways you could argue Trump transformed the presidency, but in reality, I think the presidency is really just, as I said numerous times throughout this podcast, more of a figurehead than an actual some person in charge. Ultimately, the presidency, as the rest of the U.S. government, is really just for show, I would say. The true decisions aren't being made in front of the people. A lot of times people can make laws however they feel like. The president can justify doing whatever he feels like, but the true power, I would argue, is with those who actually are enforcing the laws. The president is in charge of the branch of government that enforces the laws, but I think the actual enforcement of the laws is much more important, like the FBI agents or ICE officers or CIA agents. Those are the ones who are really doing the government footwork. Those are the ones I think libertarians should be most concerned about rather than the figurehead president, and that's my thoughts there. Next we have, Trump says he took Venezuela's oil. Here's what actually happened, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, if he did take Venezuela's oil, I wish he would share some with the U.S. with the American populace, because hopefully it would drag gas prices down a little. But yeah, personally, I think it might just be Trump being his bombastic self as per usual. Next we have, federal judge orders Pentagon to lift freeze on wind power. The judge on Thursday ordered the Pentagon to end delays that have brought U.S. wind power development to a standstill. 29 GW of wind power projects are awaiting review. Trump, my goal is to not let any windmill be built. Posted by Woke Boogeyman, that's cross-research energy subreddit, and that's in the article from the New York Times. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian position is this is a good example of why the state shouldn't be involved in energy. If people want to set up their own wind power and windmills, they should be able to. But when the state's in control of the something like wind power, they can justify not building them for whatever reason, even if it's because the president just doesn't feel like it. And I think this is a good example of why you need the state out of energy, just like you need the state out of everything else. Next we have, why is contempt of Congress even a crime? Posted by Hennel Don, and that's a crosspost from the Political Humor subreddit. And that's a meme. GOP Senate trying to jail a doctor who helped control a deadly pandemic for medicine and science. And it's a bunch of Simpsons characters with pitchforks. And it says GOP Senate confirming Trump's personal file protector as Attorney General. It's a bunch of fish from SpongeBob laughing. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you, it's all just theater, really. Of course, Reddit's going to like Dr. Fauci since they can't question whatever the legacy media says. But ultimately, it's all really just theater. They're all on the same team, the elites, I would say, and it's all just a distraction from the fact that so they're all part of the Epstein class. Blue Epstein class, red Epstein class. It's all the same Epstein class, and that's pretty much every elected official, except for a few rare exceptions like Thomas Massey or O'Connor. It's that they're just all part of the same elites who are really controlled by people behind the scenes, just like the bureaucrats. They're really also with people behind the scenes. I would say the real action when it comes to government is behind the scenes rather than what what the population actually sees. Next, we have North Carolina citizen files damages claim after Border Patrol arrested him, then left him on roadside. Posted by Jai Porcupine from Reason.com. Personally, I think the libertarian position is, if a Border Patrol agent wants to justify arresting people and leave them on the roadside, they have every ability to justify that. But ultimately, it comes down to I do think the citizen should file damage claims because you shouldn't be just arresting people and leaving them on the roadsides. But ultimately, the state has the ability to justify whatever it feels like. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it since they control the courts and legal system as well. Hopefully, this guy will get some damages in return. But if the state doesn't want to get justify giving to them, no one can really force the state to do that since they're in a position of authority just by doing whatever they feel like. Next, we have ICE spent $525 million on surveillance tech. Some of it is infringing on Americans' freedom of speech. Posted by Jai Porcupine. That's the story, an article from Reason.com. And personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, if they want to justify spending whatever they want to spend on, they have the ability to do so. And ultimately, it's not something I personally care for. But I'm sure if it was a Reddit if ICE was a Reddit aligned agency rather than an outgroup agency, if they were in-group rather than out-group, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. If ICE's purpose was we have to get rid of all hate speech and misinformation and then use the surveillance tech for that, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. But since it's used for stuff that Reddit doesn't like, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. Next, we have Trump launched big new solar tariffs. Here's what it means. In parentheses, things aren't expensive, though, declares GOP. And that's a cross post from the energy subreddit posted by Woke Man, a story from canarymedia.com. And personally, I think the libertarian position is, we should be against tariffs just because, you can buy something from cheaper from overseas. Doesn't, you should, and you want to justify doing that, you should be able to. You shouldn't have an extra tax paid on it. The libertarian position is to be against all taxes and tariffs. People won't pay them voluntarily, that's fine, but people are forced to pay so if they don't want to. And, it should be ultimately individual choice whether they want to pay them or not. So, if the state does want to implement them, they should be at the very least voluntary, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.